Hey, I'm Sara from Extra Credit Design Club, and today I'm going to take you step by step through my design process. So like I mentioned, I'm going to walk you through my process. I love to work on fictional brands. As a designer, when you're working with a client, you don't always have that opportunity to do exactly what you want. But when you're working on a fictional project, you can kind of do whatever you want and make it look however you want, and that's always fun. So today I'm going to show you my branding process for a fictional sparkling mineral water brand. Now, usually you would start with researching the brand itself, or if it's a rebrand, you would dig quite a bit into the company or the client themselves. You would try to consider their wants and their needs and how you're able to communicate that through design. But because this is a fictional brand, I'm going to skip that step and we're going to jump right into defining the brand. With the idea of it being a better alternative to drinking alcohol in a social setting, I brainstormed a few ideas of what I wanted to call the brand, and I decided to call it Better Than Bitters. The drink is going to be very focused on flavors, and it's not going to be like sugary soft drinks, and it's not going to be like bland sparkling water that you can get anywhere. It's going to be focused on complex flavors that kind of mimic the like subtle nuances of a more crafted cocktail. I wanted the brand to feel sophisticated but contemporary, and I wanted to reach out to a more youthful demographic. I knew I wanted it to look unique, unlike what all of the other competitors were doing. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to research what the competition is doing. So I put together this board of what the competition is doing, which is what you would normally do if you were pitching this to a client. As you can see, most of the competitors aren't doing exactly what it is that we are trying to do. We have some kombucha brands, we have some sparkling water with bland flavors. I knew I wanted mine to look just a little more elevated than that, so I decided to write down a few words and ideas that would help me define what I wanted the brand to look like visually. Eventually, I narrowed it down to 5 or 6 concepts, and they were nature, disruption, being the life of the party, bold flavors, and intentional consumerism. Then I narrowed it down to 2, a tie between bold flavors and being the life of the party. Ultimately, I decided that highlighting the unique flavors within the drink is helping us reach the goal that we were trying to accomplish, so I ended up going with bold flavors or unique flavors. And I thought it would be fun to lean into this idea of tastes that you don't have to acquire. This is kind of an important aside, which is a lot of times as a designer, you will help in the process of developing the tone of voice, because your brand visually needs to match some of the wording that you use within your branding. So whether you're writing that or whether the company is writing that, it's important that you try to nail down what that tone of voice is before you even begin designing. And the more copy that you can gather before you start designing, the easier it will be for you to design, because you won't be creating some final vision and then having to shove copy into it later. You'll kind of know what you're working with and you can design around it, which is much easier. Okay, so now that we have a brand direction, let's jump into mood boarding. Everyone mood boards differently. There are a lot of different ways to do it, and even I sometimes vary from project to project on how I choose to mood board. Sometimes I will just scroll endlessly through Pinterest or Dribbble or Behance, and I will just try to pull anything that matches the vision that I have in my head. Anything that I'm like, ooh, this could work, I just pull it. And sometimes that's this huge, massive list, and sometimes it's a little bit more distilled down. But that's usually the way that I like to start. I find the easiest way to do this is to just go into Pinterest. Pinterest is usually where I start, and I will type in keywords and see what I like. When I click on that image, then suggested photos that are similar or suggested designs that are similar will pop up, and I can then continue down the rabbit hole that way. Then once I have all of this content in one space, I can look at it and see what the similarities are, what things are working together, what things aren't working together. And sometimes I have a lot to work with, sometimes I only have a little bit to work with. And at that point, I can kind of narrow it down and say okay, this is kind of what I want my color palette to look like. This is kind of what I want my type to look like. This is kind of what I want my illustration to look like. Sometimes it helps me to have several mood boards for one project. One for type, one for color, one for illustration, one for layout, one for photography, and on and on. But for this project, I did a more generalized mood board. I just pulled together every photo that felt right, and I compiled it into this. I don't use Google to find source materials for my mood boards. Like I said, I usually use Pinterest or Dribbble or Behance or sometimes Pexels or Creative Market, but I realize that a lot of those are populated with other artists' work. That's kind of the point, right? So I try to take special consideration when I'm mood boarding, that I'm not just gathering a lot of work from one specific artist, but that I'm really trying to broaden my range, because I want to make sure that my work isn't just a direct ripoff of some other artist's work. Remember, at this point, we're just trying to seek inspiration. We want to make sure we're not copying somebody else's work. So like I mentioned, I wanted my brand to feel contemporary, sophisticated, and youthful, but I needed to come up with some words that felt a little bit more visual. So the words I settled on were clean, edgy, and graphic. Those were the words I selected to define the visual direction of my brand. As you can see, my mood board is pretty disparate, but it includes a lot of imagery in a tattoo style. It has some similarities in the way the illustrations are formatted, and the color palette is kind of alluded to. From here, I picked the illustrations that felt the most on brand, which were these, and I labeled them accordingly so that I would remember what I liked about them. Sometimes I feel like my mood boards are spot on, and sometimes I feel like my mood boards don't exactly match the vision that I have in my head. That's what this mood board was for me. I didn't feel like it was quite right, but it gave me a good point to start from. So based on this mood board, I knew that I wanted kind of an Americana vibe. I liked the style of tattoo illustration, but I thought putting it in kind of this clean geometric layout would help it to feel more sophisticated. The colors I chose were all colors that I just sampled straight from my mood board, and I knew I wanted to use this typeface or something like it. With my mood boards created, I'm ready to start brain dumping everything that I want onto paper. This is where I like to do it in a very tactile way on paper. So this next step is sketching and thumbnailing. Sometimes this step looks like me just kind of like doodling on the bus. Sometimes this looks like me like actually sitting down and devoting a lot of time to it. For this project, I did a little bit of both. For a couple of days, anywhere I went, I just had a sketchbook with me, and when I got an idea, I would just sketch it out in my sketchbook. So this is what that process looked like for me. And then once I kind of was like, yeah, I like this direction, I finally sat down at a larger notebook and started to thumbnail what I thought it would look like, at least how the illustrations would be formatted, because that's always an easy place for me to start. So once I sit down and translate my thoughts onto paper, then I'm able to jump into Illustrator with the thoughts that I have come up with. I wanted my sparkling beverage to be in a can, not in a bottle, and so I thought that the front of the label would be a good place to start instead of the back, for obvious reasons. And so I just started making shapes and playing around in Illustrator until I found something that started to feel right. Then I blocked where the brand, the illustrations, the flavors, I blocked where all of that was going to go before I dove right into creating the illustrations. Some people are different. Some people like to completely make something and then add the illustrations later. I'm the opposite. I feel about illustration the way I feel about copy. As much as I can have up front, the easier it is for me to design around that. So this is the point where I jumped right into starting to create my illustrations. And obviously, not every brand has an illustration. My style usually includes illustrations, and so I always like to get started in my illustration process pretty early on. A lot of times I'll do illustration in Procreate or on paper first before I load it into Illustrator, but for these I wanted them to have a pretty clean geometric look to them, so I just started right in Illustrator creating the shapes. Within Illustrator, I knew that I was just going to be making like fruits and leaves, and those things are pretty easy to just make out of shapes. I talk about this in one of my previous videos, but one of my favorite Illustrator tools is the pencil tool, because it helps me add a little bit of personalized flair when I don't want things to look too hand-drawn. So I use that a lot when I'm designing within Illustrator. So once I had worked on my illustrations for a while, they looked pretty good, but I didn't feel like they were quite right, but I needed to get out of my head a little bit. So I started creating what I thought the layout of the front of the can was going to look like, which brings us to our next step, which is design. Design, design, design. This part for me is mostly finessing. It's picking fonts, it's setting up a general structure, it's just moving pieces around, throwing things at the wall until you find things that you're like, yes, this is what I wanted it to look like. Yes, I want this. Yes, I want that. Sometimes it's pretty easy for me to settle on what I want it to look like, but this time I was really just throwing anything at the wall to see what stuck. Eventually, I landed on something that looked like this, which I really liked, but it lacked dimension. It wasn't quite perfect, so I decided it was time to refine the whole design. So this isn't necessarily its own step. It's basically just a continuation of the previous step, but sometimes it's good to step back after you've been looking at something for a long time, walk away and come back and be like, okay, I don't like this, I do like this. So we're calling this the refinement process. It's when you've already been looking at something for a long time and it's time to reevaluate, make sure this is actually the direction that you want to go. And editing for me is usually a whole ordeal because when I design, I always make something that's like too big, too maximalist. The font is huge, the illustrations are like just like whack. Like I feel like usually I'm somebody who designs really big and needs to like whittle it down. But with this project, I felt like my illustrations were too simple and I felt like my layout was like clunky. It wasn't really as sophisticated as I wanted it to be. It lacked kind of like that clean look that I was going for. So then once I eliminated these lines and just left this open, it gave it so much more room to breathe. I really liked the way that it looked, much better than the way with all of the lines. So it just goes to show that sometimes even though you have a very direct vision in your head, sometimes just like pushing that out the window and rolling with something new can look so much better. Finally, to fix the way too simple look of the art, I decided to add some texture. This was always the plan, to make it look more like a tattoo with this kind of like stippling texture. And so once I applied that effect to these illustrations, I just thought it elevated them so much and made them look exactly how I had envisioned in my head, which is always such a good feeling when you can convey exactly what it is that you wanted to convey. Then it was finally time to put on the finishing touches. Here's the part where I added all of the copy, I finessed the design, I made sure that everything lined up correctly. As I was working on this, I realized that because this product was so focused on ingredients, I wanted that section specifically to have a little more interest, to be a little more graphic. And so I added these tiny little illustrations that would just help the simplicity of the flavors pop. And then I put my final designs into a mock-up. So this is how this project turned out. Let me know what you think. If you want to see more process videos like this, let me know in the comments below. Once again, I'm Sarah from Extra Credit Design Club. Please remember to subscribe, and I will see you again next week.